Hi everybody, Dale Viktora, Field Agronomist with Beck's Hybrids, and welcome to our first edition of the Beck's Generation Farmer. And really what this is an educational based series that is going to help tie in the basics and fundamentals of agronomy, as well as some of the trials and practices that we utilize within the practical farm research and within Beck's to help you make more profitable decisions on the farm. Okay. So as we sit today, we're at the middle portion of March. Yes, there's some snow on the ground, but really in a month we could be planting corn or soybeans, right? So I want to talk about a few key things to set ourselves up for success when we talk about planting corn or soybeans. So we're, a lot of that it will be around planting depth, planting date, and things like that of what to consider, and which plant or which crop should I plant first. That's kind of a moving target a lot of times, but as we think about it, the old adage used to be that we should always plant our corn first, all right? And yes, 9 times out of 10, the first corn that we plant is going to be the best yielding corn on the farm, right? But let's not get too hung up on that, because there is an opportunity to be pushing soybean yields by pushing them early as well. As we look at the last couple of years within PFR as well as on-farm research, we see that planting soybeans early definitely pays. Part of that is because soybeans are a photosensitive crop. And what that means is the longer that they're in the vegetative state before flowering, they will put on more nodes, okay? And the more nodes that a soybean plant puts on, that'll equate to more pods, all right? So ultimately, that's going to give us more yield. So we want to make sure that we're capturing as much sunlight as we can prior to flowering. And now, they're photosensitive, so the summer solstice, as we get into June there, that's really what triggers. It's the long nights is what triggers the flowering of the soybean plant, okay? So if we can have them in a vegetative state longer, we'll ultimately capture more yield. But as we look at planting corn or soybeans, big thing is we want to make sure that we get our planting depth right, and ultimately a good fit soil or seed bed, right? So ultimately, as we look at corn and soybeans, the soil fitness, or the fitness of the soil, should really be our driving factor. So as we look at corn, when we want to target what is the best optimal seeding depth of corn, ultimately it's usually about 2 inches. Now that can change, and it can change from field to field on your operation. Soil types will drive this, okay? So yes, 2 inches, that's a great universal starting point. That second knuckle on your finger, it seems like about every farmer has a second knuckle, right? That's 2 inches long. So yeah, it's a pretty good gauge for us, but ultimately, some fields we might need to be going a little bit deeper than that. Corn has the genetic potential to push of upwards to 5 inches. I am not telling you to plant your corn at 5 inches, but what I'm saying is don't be afraid of 2 1/4, 2 1/2 if we have to get it into moisture. That's the big thing, because the corn kernel itself needs to take up 30% of its weight in water to induce germination, okay? So we want to make sure we're planting into optimal moisture, because ultimately we want uniform, even emergence, and what it takes for that is consistent temperature and consistent moisture, and usually that's what that 2-inch mark gets us. But this is going to take getting out of the planter, digging around in that seed trench, making sure, hey, do I get good seed to soil contact? Is there moisture here? And make sure that we're planting into the right moisture. The other thing that 2 inches does for corn is it allows good nodal root development, okay? So the nodal roots on the corn plant will really take off later on in its life, and they'll be the primary feed source. That's usually in that V4, V5 time frame, so that's a little bit later on in this plant's life, but at where that nodal root develops is usually around 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface. So a good seeding depth to start with will allow a good root structure the rest of this plant's life, okay? Too shallow, we can get into some floppy corn syndrome, things like that. We don't want that to happen, okay? So make sure we're targeting that depth correctly. Now on soybeans, on the other hand, we really, a lot of times we don't really need to move much on soybeans. A lot of guys like to shallow up a lot and just get the soybeans kind of covered up a little bit and go, but really we want to be looking at that 1.5 to 1 3/4, target that for planting soybeans as well, because the soybean plant itself, the seedling, or the seed, it needs 50% of its weight in water to induce germination, okay? And so as we look at that, we need to make sure we're in consistent soil depth, or a consistent depth that has consistent moisture, okay? So that's the big thing. We've all planted soybeans before where maybe we planted them a little too shallow and fields are very dry, and we'll get sporadic emergence. We don't want that in corn or soybeans because we want everybody to come up fairly uniform, roughly within the same amount of time to help capture sunlight and start this factory off, okay? The other thing is on soybeans, they're a legume crop, okay? That means that they create nodules that create their own nitrogen, right? Now the thing is nodule formation, 75% of that is started at planting depth level, okay? So as we think about this is, in that 1.5-inch range, that is the most consistent temperature range that'll help nodulation, okay? So we want to make sure that we get this thing set off to the right point where we can make sure that we're getting enough nodules on this plant to help, promote as much nitrogen fixation as possible. So that's a big thing. But as we look at it, when we think about this, we go, okay, we've planted corn and soybeans, make sure we get our depth right. But there might be a time where, early planted soybeans pay. There might be a time where it might be a good idea to switch from corn to soybeans before you're even done planting corn. Now, what that could be is if we look out on the horizon and we got a cool front coming with some cold rain. Because ultimately, the corn plant, to induce germination, when it takes that first drink in the first 24 to 48 hours, if that's a cold drink, what can happen is that can rupture the cell wall of the seed, and what'll happen is you'll get a corkscrewing, and that thing won't emerge, right? So that we want to eliminate. Now, sometimes we can mitigate that by planting soybeans because they're a little less sensitive to that cold temperature swing like that. So if we get into maybe a little bit more unfavorable conditions, forecast looks a little rougher, might not be a bad idea switching to beans. Yes, it takes a little time to change the plates over and things like that, but it might be a good idea to look at that to help overall to get the best stand establishment on our corn. Might be waiting, okay? Now, you'll have a lot of guys tell you that, hey, soil temperature's gotta be at 50 degrees before we can plant corn. We're in southern Minnesota, that's not true, okay? Yes, that is optimal. It's great if we can have 50-degree soil temperature, but a lot of times our window isn't there. So, and a lot of times that if the soil's fit, that should be ultimately your driver to decide, hey, today's a good day to plant corn. If that soil is fit, forecast looks good, we should be planting. We should not be waiting for an optimal 50-degree soil temperature all the time because you know what? Just doesn't always happen, right? So those are some key things to think about as we go forward and we start thinking about, getting planter rolling and thinking about which crop we're going to plant first. Make sure those simple steps of the depth, seeding depth is tremendous. The next thing would be is we're going to start talking about that planter setup because we're only a few weeks to a month away of planting this crop. So we want to make sure we get it planted the correct way and we have ourselves set up for success. So really, that's ultimately what I wanted to share today. The next update, we're going to talk about some of those planter settings and ways to set ourselves up for success there, making sure that we're putting the seed in the ground, the right way the first time, right? So ultimately, that's what we got going on. So I appreciate you tuning in. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.